like to introduce you to Dr. Simon Draper, who's the assistant editor for the Oxford VCH, previously worked for the VCH in Gloucestershire, where he now lives. He's a landscape archaeologist by training, and he was keen to tell me when we spoke first that he is a native Wiltshireman, and his research has been published, his PhD was published in 2006. So let me, without further ado, hand over to Simon, who's going to tell us all about Anglo-Saxon Bremhill. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Martin. I hope you can all hear me. If you wave, then I'll know that you can hear me. I see some waving. Yes.
Yeah, no, you're all good. And I should have said people should go on mute, please, while Simon's presenting. You might want to put it on slide show, Simon.
Yes, I will. Yeah. Okay. Right. From the beginning. Yes. Aha. Right. Great. So yes, in the dim distant past, I did a PhD on Anglo-Saxon Wiltshire. As Martin correctly said, I'm a Wiltshireman from Holt, near Bradford-on-Avon. That's my place of origin. But I then went to study at Durham. So my PhD on Anglo-Saxon Wiltshire was at Durham. And then I've moved around a lot ever since. So I came to Gloucestershire, where I now live. I'm talking to you from very near Cheltenham Racecourse, where I live. I worked for the Victoria County History, that's the VCH, basically sort of researching and writing parish histories in Gloucestershire, and now I do the same in Oxfordshire. But my first love has always been Anglo-Saxon landscape and archaeology and place names, and particularly the relationship between place names and archaeology and the landscape in the Anglo-Saxon period. And that's what sort of I hope to combine in this talk with a focus on Bremhill, which caught my attention in my PhD and in my book. And in my book, there is this picture of the village, which is on my front page. I must say, though, in the book, which was published more than 10 years ago, I had a different idea about the origin of this. I think there's an oval enclosure, which is shown by the dashed line. And I had a different idea about its origin over 10 years ago. So my views have actually changed in the last decade since I wrote that book. So I'm giving you the up-to-date version of my views on how this enclosure, Anglo-Saxon enclosure, if that's what it is, how that formed. Right. You can now see the next slide. We're going to start in the middle Anglo-Saxon period, which was about AD 600 to 750. It's the period where Christianity was introduced, the pagan Saxons were converted to Christianity, and also kings and kingdoms were getting going. The sort of fledgling kingdom of Wessex was beginning to form in Wiltshire. And the very earliest kings of Wessex seem to have carved up the landscape into very large estates. Some people call them multiple estates, but I use the term great estates. And it seems that most of Wiltshire was carved up into these large estates with a royal hall, a royal manor house in effect, at the centre of each one. Of course, kings were peripatetic at this time. They constantly moved around with their court from place to place. They never stayed in one place. So the kings had numerous manor houses to choose from. And next door to the estate centre, the house, they would found a church, what's known as a minster church, an important Anglo-Saxon church serving a large area. But within these estates also lived the ordinary farming folk, the peasants, if you like, and actually their status is often reflected in place names in these estates. So within these estates, you get place names like Walton, for example, which means the settlement or farm of the slaves. So they're the people at the bottom of the heap. And then moving up the social status, you get places called Knighton, which means the farm of the household servants or retainers, the people sort of serving the king when he came to stay. And then also in the middle, you've got places like Charlton, which means the farm of the churls, the the sort of free farmers, people who weren't bondsmen, they weren't peasants at the very bottom, but they were still peasants, but they were allowed to get on with their own farming. They were sort of semi-autonomous peasants, I suppose. So within these estates, you get place names reflecting the status of the people who lived in these satellite settlements. This is effectively, these are satellites, all dependent on the estate centre. You also get directional place names. So place names like Sutton here, for example, that means the south farm. And if you see a place called Norton or Sutton or Eastern or Western, you have to ask yourself the question, north of? And the answer usually is an Anglo-Saxon estate centre, one of these royal estate centres. And then you get place names like Hardwick, the sheep farm, and Berwick, the grain farm, and Stoke, the dependent farm. So you get all these place names sort of as a legacy of this period when they were all satellite farms, the king, the royal centre in the middle. These royal estates, Anglo-Saxon royal estates, more or less fossilised as what became the hundreds of Wiltshire. So you may have heard the term 100. 100 it was originally supposed to be 100 hides of land, a hide being about 120 acres, and every 100 hides was supposed to be this area of the 100. The people of the 100 had to have regular meetings every few weeks to sort of discuss how they were going to run their 100 and catch criminals, for example. So this is, and the hundreds are first recorded in Domesday Book in 1086. And so using Domesday Book, we can reconstruct the hundreds of Domesday of Wiltshire, of Anglo-Saxon Wiltshire. And sure enough, I mean, a lot of them became areas dependent on what would later become medieval market towns. So places like Chippenham, Calne, Warminster, Westbury, Mere, Amesbury, places like that, the sort of the market towns of Wiltshire, first sort of originated as these Anglo-Saxon royal estate centres. And of course, Chippenham was famously a royal estate where King Alfred the Great overwintered in the Christmas of 877 to 878, before the famous Battle of Edington, his defeat of the Vikings, his victory over the Vikings at Edington. So we know that kings did actively stay at Chippenham, at the heart of the Chippenham royal estate. And so Chippenham 100 does seem to reflect at least the core of this Anglo-Saxon estate. And sure enough, as you'll see, Bremhill formed the easternmost parish within Chippenham 100. And we can be fairly certain that it was dependent on Chippenham in the Anglo-Saxon period. And in the parish, we have one of these place names reflecting the status of people who lived in these satellite settlements. So Charlcut is the cottages of the churls. I've talked about the churls. So a Charlton is the farm of the churls, and a Charlcot or a Charlcut are the cottages of these churls, these free farmers, the Anglo-Saxon middle classes, basically. That's who they were. And so we've got one of these place names surviving in Bremhill, which is quite nice. But you see these Anglo-Saxon estates broke up in the late Saxon period, between about 800 and 1050. The king started granting out lands to his noblemen, or thanes as they were called, in order to buy their military allegiance. He would basically give a nobleman land in exchange for a nobleman promising to supply men for military service when the threat of the Vikings increased, for example. So a lot of the parishes that are in Chippenham 100, like Corsham or Box or Colerne or Bremhill, probably originated as when the estate was carved up and dished out by the king to his cronies in this period, between about 800 and 1050. And actually, and Harden Hewish, I don't know, you see Harden Hewish here, was one of the smallest parishes of Wiltshire, but actually the Hewish bit of the place name means a hide of land, one of these 120 acre units And that seems to be the sort of smallest building block, the smallest size an Anglo-Saxon estate could be. And actually, we've got a document, a charter, that records the granting out of Harden Hewish in the 800s. So Harden Hewish splintered off from Chippenham very early in this process, 800 or so. But this process continued throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, and it's recorded in these documents that we call Anglo-Saxon Charters. These are documents that very often survive in monastic archives. So Malmesbury Abbey, the medieval library of Malmesbury Abbey, had a stock of these Anglo-Saxon documents that record the king dishing out these lands, either to monasteries or to his cronies, his thanes. And this picture here shows the actual Anglo-Saxon Charter, and they often start off in Latin, but then they suddenly turn into Old English for what's known as the boundary clause. They actually describe the boundary of the piece of land being given out from landmark to landmark, as if people were walking around the parish boundary or the estate boundary, and they're always in a clockwise direction. That seems to be the sort of legal way they did it. It was always in a clockwise direction, starting and finishing at one particular boundary mark. So that's what that is. That bit is the Old English boundary clause. And then at the bottom, you've got the witnesses, the people signing their name to this charter. And this graph at the bottom of the slide shows sort of how many of these charters were granted out decade by decade. So you can see that I mentioned Harden Hewish was one of the early ones, about 800. But suddenly in the 10th and 11th centuries, there's a real increase. The kings seem to be very keen to dish out lands left, right and centre. And sure enough, there are the three charters that we have that relate to Bremhill Parish all date from this period. So the earliest is 937, and then 974, and then finally 1065. We've got three surviving charters that purport to be directly related to Bremhill Parish, except at the top, I've said that they were often forged, and particularly monasteries, abbeys, were notorious at forging these documents to try and prove their title to estates that they didn't actually have a legal right to own. So many scholars have tied themselves up in knots trying to work out which charters are genuine or which are later forgeries. And the problem is compounded by the fact that the texts often only survive in much later copies of originals. So we don't have many actual original documents. They seem to be sort of 11th or 12th century transcriptions by monks copying an earlier, the original document, which has since been lost. So it's difficult to tell. But anyway, we've got the first one, 937, King Athelstan granting to Malmesbury Abbey 60 hides at Bremhill. And 60 hides is a huge amount of land. It's 60 times 120 acres. So that's a lot bigger than it's probably a lot bigger than the current parish, I imagine. But that's considered to be a forgery by Jonathan Pitt, who wrote his PhD on this subject back in before 2003, and also published an article in Wiltshire Archaeological Magazine in 2003 discussing the Bremhill Charters. So that's my source, and he says that's a forgery. And then in 974, King Edgar is supposed to have granted out land at Avon in Bremhill, which had been forfeited by the Thane Ethelnoth. And again, that's probably a spurious charter. There might be a grain of truth in it, but it seems to be partly made up at least. And then the latest one, 1065, King Edward, Edward the Confessor, grants to Malmesbury Abbey lands, 38 hides of land at Bremhill, bizarrely including a tiny bit of Collern. So it seems that in 1065, a tiny corner of Collern parish was considered part of the Bremhill estate. I don't know how that was possible, but there you go. And that is considered spurious, but the 38 hides bit is actually reflected in Domesday Book. So when we come to Domesday Book in 1086, Bremhill was this large estate 38 hides, so that's 38 times 120 acres. And we definitely know that it did belong to Malmesbury Abbey. So what we can be certain of is that Malmesbury Abbey had acquired a large estate at Bremhill by 1066. Although Domesday Book is 1086, it discusses the situation of land ownership as it was from 1066, from the conquest. So we know, we can be sure that Malmesbury Abbey owned a large estate at Bremhill by 1066, but we can't say for sure when they acquired it, and we can't say for sure that they had it by the 900s, because these documents up here might be forgeries. So I think we have to be a bit cautious about when Malmesbury Abbey got hold of the Bremhill estate. Oh, right. I've gone previous, right. I skipped 2 slides at once. But my theory is that what if Malmesbury Abbey actually acquired Bremhill, not from the king, but from one of these thanes to whom the Bremhill estate had already been granted by the king? I mean, could it be that in the 900s, the king actually granted Bremhill to one of these cronies, these thanes, these aristocrats, who then in turn gave it to Malmesbury Abbey? That would be quite a common sequence of events. When these thanes got hold of estates, they often built manor houses around them, and also founded parish churches next door to their manor houses. And that's the origin of the church being next door to a manor house that you get in so many English villages today. But we have this interesting law that said that it's not only thanes that these churls, these free farmers, could actually become a thane. You could effectively climb the greasy pole of society. You could move from a free farmer to becoming a lord if you owned certain things. If you have 5 hides of land, 5 times 120 acres, and you have a church, and you have a gatehouse and a bell, a seat and a special office in the King's Hall, if you had all these things, then you could now call yourself a thane. You could effectively become a lord by owning all these things. And the 5 hides of land is important, because that's why you get so many places called Fifield. There's Fifield near Marlborough in Wiltshire, and Fifield actually means 5 hides of land in Old English. So it's one of these smallest estates that you could own to become a thane. And actually in the landscape, you can actually trace out on the ground the enclosures built by these Anglo-Saxon thanes around their manor houses and churches. The term Burr Gate or Burr Gate was used in that Anglo-Saxon documents, and it literally means the gate of the Burr, B-U-R-H, and that seems to be the Anglo-Saxon word that was used to describe one of these enclosures around their settlements. So if we go to a place like Saintbury in Gloucestershire, which the place name literally translates as Sewina's enclosure, and we can be fairly sure that Sewina was actually the name of the Anglo-Saxon thane, aristocrat, sometime in the 900s or 1000s, let's say, who actually built the first church and his manor house. You can actually see the footprint of a manor house here, and I hope you can see the whole thing is in an oval enclosure, and the earthworks still survive. Even when the earthworks don't survive, you can often see these enclosures showing through in maps. So this is Whitchurch on Thames on the left in Oxfordshire, and I hope you can see that the churchyard, the church was actually within this sort of oval enclosure, and then the village was tacked on to it. The same in Codford St Peter, to use a Wiltshire example, where you've got St Peter's Church, but even today there are footpaths around this enclosure here with the dotted line surrounding the church, and you can see how this road coming in for the north diverts around the edge of the enclosure. When it hits the enclosure, it diverts. And in fact, the name, the Bury is still a local place name used to describe that enclosure, which is the Anglo-Saxon word for enclosure. And not only that, but Codford St Peter is linked with the famous Codford cross shaft, Anglo-Saxon piece of sculpture, which you see here, which dates from the 9th century. So there's some good physical evidence that there was something important going on here in the 9th century. Somebody important was living here and building a church. And basically, this is what I think we've got at Bremhill. That's what I'm coming toward. The whole talk is gearing up to saying that I think what we've got at Bremhill is an Anglo-Saxon thane's, a lord's enclosure around his manor house and church, built probably in the sort of 10th century, sometime like that. So here's the parish church, and then you've got Manor Farm, and you've got a handy spring, so you've got a handy source of water, and then the whole thing is in this oval enclosure, and then you've got the sort of village tacked on to the high status enclosure. Down here on the bottom right, I put Goring-on-Thames in Oxfordshire, because that's one of the recent villages I've been writing the history of for my day job. And you see the similarity between Bremhill and Goring. They have almost identical village plans. And at Goring, you can see the church, the parish church, which is there, that building there that I got my arrow on, that's the parish church. And then the rectory house and the manor house are all within this oval enclosure, actually butting onto the River Thames here. But you can see how the village is just tacked on next to it, and it's almost identical to Bremhill. And then, of course, at Bremhill, you've got the Anglo-Saxon masonry within the church tower. So we know that there was some sort of Anglo-Saxon church at Bremhill, just to add some physical evidence. But in the future, I would like to see an archaeologist come along and dig a trench across the line of this enclosure that I've marked out here in Bremhill, and test the theory that this is a late Anglo-Saxon ditch, boundary ditch, dug around a thane's house and church. It would be nice to find some late Saxon pottery in there one day. So that's a challenge to future archaeologists. So there we are. In conclusion, therefore, I think that this enclosure in Bremhill is an indicator that an Anglo-Saxon lord owned the estate at some point, a thane, one of these new aristocrats, probably in the 900s, and he built his church and manor house there. And then the thane, in turn, gave the whole manor to Malmesbury Abbey, presumably to sort of ease his soul through purgatory, and to say what a jolly good and pious person he was. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd love to hear your questions and comments.
Excellent. Really, thank you very much indeed. That was most illuminating. If you could unshare your screen now, then
Right,
it lets
okay.
us see everybody else who's there. And please, we've got time for some questions and comments. Who wants to start? You can wave your hand at me, or just speak. Any questions or comments?
Martin, I wouldn't mind adding a comment if that's all right. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I'd say that I've lived with this kind of stuff for years and years, but I've never heard it so succinctly and comprehensively described. So I congratulate Simon on the way he's done it. A little bit of it I was going to talk about tomorrow when I talk about boundaries, and I noticed that in addition to the 38 hides of Bremhill, there's a 2-hide estate where you live in Chippenham, which of course one of the things that Anglo-Saxon historians do is their sums. So that if you put the two together, you've got a 40-hide estate, and then of course you're into the business of tithings and divisions of hundreds. And I wondered what Simon thought about actually thinking of that this 2 hides has been lopped off, so we've actually got a 40-hide estate. We really need him to help us with this little bit of the VCH, I think, which we always have to deal with. Anyway, I'll pass it back to Simon.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, I've never tried to tot up all the hides that are supposed to be in Chippenham 100. But certainly we know that Anglo-Saxons like to work in round numbers of hides. So you often get 5 hide estates all over the place. But also if you look in Domesday Book, 10 hide estates crop up very frequently as well. And then 20 hide estates. And then, yeah, so 40 is a nice round number. And that would be attractive to Anglo-Saxons carving up the landscape, certainly. So I think it's entirely possible. I don't know the details enough to sort of pass a further comment. But one of the Anglo-Saxon charters about Bremhill mentioned a 60 odd hide estate, didn't it? So I don't know quite. So that's an even larger.
I think we might be talking about Titherton Lucas and a few other places tacked onto it, don't you?
Yes, well, yes, clearly there was an even larger chunk of land that was sort of thought of as Greater Bremhill at some point in the Anglo-Saxon period. And certainly
Sorry, in parish terms, in religious terms, Malmesbury Abbey also owned a place called Highway, which is detached, and that's part of the medieval parish of Bremhill.
Right.
And that's a Malmesbury estate, so it may be that somehow they're connected earlier on. I don't know.
Yeah.
No idea.
And John, do you know anything about this place Uridge in Colerne and quite why that is supposed to be part of Bremhill in the charter?
No idea. Sorry. Is it a Malmesbury possession? No, it doesn't come to Malmesbury. No,
I don't know.
No idea. No. Sorry.
Okay. Any other questions and comments from our assembled company?
Oh, there's one.
Ewan, if you unmute, then we can hear you.
How's that?
Yep.
Thank you, Simon, very much for that. I found that extremely interesting. But particularly what you just said recently, because I've often wondered, looking at some of the vicars in Bremhill parish, that they actually had to go to Highway. And Highway is a heck of a long way from Bremhill if all you've got is a horse and cart.
Yeah.
And I can see now from what you said, the fact that Malmesbury owned it, why perhaps it was in the same parish. But what I was actually going to ask was, I was interested when you had showed the map of the hundreds, what had happened to poor old Devizes? Because Devizes didn't seem to exist.
No, well, that's right. It didn't exist. The place name Devizes is actually a very rare Norman French place name, which is Norman French for in Devizes, literally it means on the boundary in Norman French. And actually Devizes was a new Norman foundation with a Norman castle plonked there just after the conquest. And it was on the boundary of 200s, two estates. And so the Norman name tells you that it's a sort of new place on the boundary of 2 older estates.
Right. Fine, thank you.
Any residents of Bremhill got any perspectives on that, having lived on the ground? Does it seem to stack up from where you sit? Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was. It does, and part of it, part of the enclosure is on my land actually, and I was quite intrigued that you were having thoughts of a dig. Is that on the cards?
Well, yes. I don't know who would carry it out. I'm sort of trying to sort of enthuse you basically. To maybe either get together in the future if you want to take your interest in Bremhill history further, and in consultation with the county archaeologist and county archaeological unit, I suppose. It maybe put a trial trench or a test pit or something across it in the future.
What we do have a connection with the archaeology field group of the Wiltshire Archaeological Natural History Society, and they've done some test pitting up at the top of the hill in Foxham looking for a Romano British settlement, and they've actually been having a dig around or probe around our place here looking for the previous house. So Chris, if you're up for that, I'm sure they would be interested in having certainly doing the non-invasive geophysical at some point first. It's worth giving some thought to where you do it. It's quite a labour-intensive process, but no, that could be very interesting.
Yes, I mean,
absolutely. Well, I suppose as long as they kind of put things back nicely, as it were. But I've long thought that the area is very rich in Iron Age archaeology, and would you know how to position the dig so as to either avoid Iron Age stuff or incorporate it?
Yes, I suppose you would need a full geophysical survey first, I suppose, to see what might be beneath the ground. That would be the first step I would advise. Getting a geophysical survey across most of that oval enclosure, or any piece of land that hasn't got buildings on. That would be the first.
Okay, thank you.
Questions and comments, Louise?
Hi, I just want to say thank you to Simon. That was absolutely fantastic. Do you think there's any possibility of us finding out who that particular thane was? And is there any likelihood that we could find any evidence of the thane giving Bremhill to Malmesbury? Is there any documentary evidence that's yet to be discovered on this?
I'm afraid to say I think it's highly unlikely. Yes, I think those 3 charters are basically all that seems to be known and seems to survive. Of course, yes, these charters are catalogued by a chap called Peter Sawyer. And so on my slides, I put S numbers. There's S such and such, and that's the Sawyer number. And there's a website you can go to known as the e-Sawyer, the electronic Sawyer. So if you Google e-Sawyer, S-A-W-Y-E-R, and then that brings up the catalogue, and then you can type in the Sawyer number into the database, and it'll bring up the full text of the full charter, and so you can actually see all, and also it tells you, it gives you a list of who has written about it,
Yeah.
what publications are available, and further sources to consult. But yes, I think the prospects of finding the name of the person are very slim. With Whitchurch, I showed on one of my slides, we do have a name. There's a chap called Leofric, or Leofric, and we can be pretty sure that it was he who built the church and the enclosure, because there is the surviving documentary evidence in charter form. But none of these charters that relate to Bremhill seem to offer a real clue. And I think it highly unlikely, I'm afraid, that any Anglo-Saxon charters are lurking in attics, or I think it would be quite well, I don't know, I suppose it must have happened, but I think it would be fairly remote. So I think we just must resign ourselves to not knowing, I'm afraid.
Unless, of course, one of the minor place names in Bremhill Parish somehow has fossilised the name of the Saxon owner, I suppose. But you would never be able to prove that, would you?
No. I mean, yes, Cadenham certainly refers to somebody called Cadder or such like, but whether that was the name of the man who had any link to Bremhill, we just won't, we don't know.
Fascinating. Anybody else got questions or comments for Simon, please? I've got one then, Simon. What else would you expect to find within one of these oval enclosures, originally, and what might one expect if one was able to do a proper study? What would you expect to see there?
Well, yes, I would expect to see the remains of effectively the Anglo-Saxon manor house, let's call it, the Thane's house, which was presumably a timber-framed building. It's highly unlikely to have been stone, so it probably would have been a timber-framed affair. And they often have a bell tower attached. There's been an excavation recently at Bishopstone in Sussex of one of these Thanes residences, and sure enough, there was the sort of timber-framed manor house, and then next door a sort of freestanding bell tower. Yes, I mean, the power of sound and ringing a bell would have been very useful to tell people working in the fields what time it is, or to summon people to meetings. So I think the power of bells in the past shouldn't be underestimated. So they seem to have a bell tower, and then a sort of a fence or a ditch around the outside. And then, of course, there would have been a church, some form of Anglo-Saxon church or chapel, probably, again, possibly timber-framed and much smaller. And I mean, possibly not on the exact site of the later parish church, but it might well be under the current parish church, so you'd never find it.
And would the fence and ditch have been...
That church is a minster church with dependent chapels. I mean, we know it had a chapel at Foxham, but do you think it had minster status?
Well, there lies the thorny question, because back in my book, if you read the relevant section in my book, I sort of went along with Jonathan Pitt's suggestion that it was a minster church.
Yes, I know that, yes. You changed your mind, haven't you?
Yes, and I changed my mind, because I think it might have been a minster very late on in the Anglo-Saxon period, but I don't think it's one of these early original minsters. I think Chippenham. I think Chippenham was probably the original mother church, and if Bremhill did become a minster, only became a minster very, very late on, possibly even only after Malmesbury Abbey got hold of it, and probably. Yes, and then Corsham as well. Corsham is a high status church as well.
Yeah.
You've got too many high status churches in a small area. That's the problem.
And Simon, would the ditch and fence have been to keep animals in or people out?
A mixture of both, and also it's sort of a show of status, just like people building medieval castles. I mean, they built castle walls to keep people out and to be strong, but also as a sort of show of, look what I can do, and this is my enclosure. And just as castles had fancy gatehouses, I think these Anglo-Saxon enclosures might well have had quite fancy gatehouses as well. It's just a show of status. This is the Lord's enclosure. So I think the idea of these things as proto-castles, actually that's something that is actually entering the academic literature. Professor John Blair of Oxford University has written an excellent recent book, widely available in bookshops, called Building Anglo-Saxon England. And there's a chapter on these things, and he basically thinks that these Anglo-Saxon Thanely enclosures were sort of the forerunners of what became castles. So the Normans might not have introduced the idea of castles into England. They might have been sort of gradually brewing up in Anglo-Saxon England beforehand.
And picking up on Chris's point, are there any examples of where there has been an Iron Age hill fort where there's subsequently been a Saxon enclosure? Yes, so
that was quite a common thing. I mean, it happens at Malmesbury. I mean, the Malmesbury Abbey enclosure. I mean, the town of Malmesbury is built inside an Iron Age hill fort that was then repurposed as a monastic enclosure, an Anglo-Saxon monastic enclosure and town enclosure. And there's other places like Whittlebury in Northamptonshire, I think, where there's an Iron Age hill fort, and then a church and a manor house was sort of popped inside it, and it was reused. Also, Bybury in Gloucestershire, I think there's evidence of an Iron Age hill fort again being repurposed as either a Thanely or a minster enclosure. So yes, it's a common sequence of events that ready-made Iron Age enclosures get reused as Anglo-Saxon ones. I wouldn't be surprised at that.
Okay, Robert, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yes, I have to start with an apology. I apologise to all. I live in Caen, and I don't live in the Bremhill area. But I'm assuming Thank you. I've enjoyed I drove around today and saw some of the sites on your history trail, and I'd like to say thank you to all of you who organised the trail and the talks. I've enjoyed it immensely. Good. Simon, if you're using a model that's applicable in many places, then I assume your model of the thaned enclosure with the manor house and the bell tower would also apply to Caen. And we have a place in Caen called Kingsbury Street, which shows some relationship with the king.
Yes.
And so I suppose the king would,
Yes.
using your model and how you're using it to analyse Bremhill, it'd be the same in Caen, that the king would have sold land to a thane, who would have enclosed it, put a bell tower in there and his house in there. And it's somewhere around the area that we call Kingsbury Street and the Green at the present moment.
Well, I think the Kingsbury, wherever you find the place name Kingsbury, then that's telling you that it's the king's own manor house. So I think at Caen, king would have retained it, and it would have always been a royal manor house. He would have given it out. And in fact, we know there's good documentary evidence of the king staying at Caen, and also meetings. The Anglo-Saxon council called the Witan is recorded as meeting in Caen inside a building where the ceiling collapsed during an Anglo-Saxon meeting. So there is actually documentary evidence of important royal meetings being held at Caen. And the Kingsbury actually records the presence of this enclosure. There's another Kingsbury in Wilton. Wilton in South Wiltshire has Kingsbury Square. And again, if you look at that, you can actually see the oval enclosure on the town plan. And Chippenham, I believe, has a street called Ebury Street or something similar. I don't know how you pronounce it.
Emery it is.
Was it Emery? Yes, Emery.
Yes,
I was Emery.
yes. Within the borough, yes.
Right, yes, there's a street in Chippenham called Emery that actually originated in Old English as Abury, which means sort of outside the enclosure or around the enclosure. So I think even in Chippenham, you can actually see see in the street plan where the king's enclosure would have been in Chippenham.
Well, if I may, because I've done that bit, where the post office used to be in Chippenham and the church, there is a similar oval enclosure, exactly as Simon describes. So that little bit which goes to St Mary's Street at the back, and where the old post office was on the corner, and then the church, it is, I'm sure, the Kingsbury for Chippenham. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, John.
Right. We've massively extended our time, which is great. Any further questions for Simon? Good. All right. Well, Simon, thank you so much for a really thought-provoking talk. It's been really very exciting and given us lots of food for thought. And we're going to have to go and get our thinking caps on as to how we can try and prove your theory. But it really, thank you for your time and a great talk.
Thank you very much. Not at all. It's been a pleasure.
And look forward to seeing many or all of you for tomorrow night's two talks, which we'll have one at 6 and 6:30. The timing may not be exactly, we may blend from one into the other, and I know that John will be picking up on some of the themes of boundaries and relating it to the broader Bremhill landscape. So it'll work very well for the people who've heard tonight's talk. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.